Thank you for a very inspiring session, going far beyond safety and dwelling into the current thinking of Zika vaccine development. I think for the last session, I have agreed with the session chair that we'll kind of restructure this a little bit, in that I will try, like this morning, to give a brief summary of today, so to see if you agree with the Reader's Digest of today, and whether you feel that any key points are missing. And then Stephen Hirschfield will provide his view on potential next steps. And we'd then like to see how we can go about, if you like, the summary key points and what we can agree as consensus formation as a result of this conference. We would like to see a conference report being written where some of the recommendations that have been crystallized over the last 2 days could be put in print. So let's see how we're succeeding on this. It's a bit of an ad hoc exercise, and it's been a very dense 2 days in terms of information. So let me see if you agree with the summary of key points. I think it became clear in the observational study session that there is a need for active and enhanced surveillance. This is just, the spontaneous reporting is not going to do the trick alone. It is an important component, but there's a need for active and enhanced surveillance, and we'll need to find a shared understanding of what that actually means, but at least it means to have background rates in a prospective fashion and to have some sort of observational studies set up that are suitable for the outcomes we agree to monitor. It became clear that not only in the realm of trials, but also in the realm of observational studies, there's a lack of standards. And I think the point was made, and it seemed to me there was agreement. Already yesterday was the suggestion that the clinical trial guidelines could be leveraged maybe for the development of observational study guidelines. I think today this was emphasized, and it seemed to me this was fairly much agreed, that there's a need for guidelines for observational studies. And I think today it was specifically emphasized that there's a need to do this for electronic health record studies, or alternatives, if it's not an electronic health record, some other health information system. And the question here, the proposal I think was made that we could derive from what has happened, what has been done, and potentially match that with the learnings as the field is expanding, and derive a minimal set of study requirements for such studies. And that could be a minimal set of outcomes, and that could be a best practice guidance in terms of methods. So how can these methods be translated to the low and medium income country setting? I think it was also emphasized that whatever we do pre-licensure is nice, and what we do post-licensure is also nice, but unless we think in terms of vaccine life cycle, we're going to have that good old gap again. And so we need to see that as we go into these programs, and as the trials evolve and the products get licensed, that we actually have an integrated way of monitoring for safety outcomes appropriate for the different study, but so that we don't end up with monitoring one thing pre-licensure and the other post-licensure, and we're lacking integration. Data completeness and precision was a big topic, and there were little sort of different elements that I was trying to collect here. One is that it was very clear that there's a poor correlation between LMP and ultrasound for gestational age assessment. There was a poor compliance with antenatal visits, and the question was how to overcome that in terms of data missingness. Outcome assessment, how do we deal with this if there's home delivery rather than hospital delivery? I think it became clear that it takes an extraordinary effort to manage a cohort prospectively. If we've seen what it takes to monitor 500, the management of 500 pregnancies, and all the efforts that need to go there into this, if data quality is high, then the question is how do we manage this on a population level? It was highlighted that there are cultural limitations to outcome assessment. So some of the outcomes we may not be able to assess outcomes in all settings in the same kind of way due to cultural restrictions. And that's not something that can be overcome by methodological diligence. There's a need for metrics of data quality. I thought that was one of the key issues made today, is that somehow we need to figure out, given that we have different degrees of data quality, how can we kind of classify or measure this? Community recruitment was emphasized as a really and shown as a really successful way of recruiting. And one of the questions was, can we derive from the experiences made in successful cohorts so far? Can we learn something, and can we derive criteria for successful community recruitment in other areas? Applicability of case definitions was a topic, and I think we've seen that data can be obtained, so the data that need to go in to inform the case definitions can be obtained. We see that lower levels, we've seen as expected, that lower levels of certainty have higher sensitivity or capture in this regard. But we've also seen that not all outcomes have 100% sensitivity at level 3, and that's something that is certainly important and needs to be looked at more closely in where that exactly is coming from. In terms of malformation, there was when discussing the malformation outcome, there was repeatedly the comment made, can training replace expertise? So in areas where disease expertise is missing, can that be replaced by training? I think that point was also made related to data safety monitoring boards and other safety assessment committees. If there is the pertinent expertise missing, how can this be brought to these groups so that the relevant expertise is there, either by selection of the appropriate professional background, but also by specific training of those that are there and just do not have the highly specialized knowledge. Site selection, I think, was a topic, and here the question was utility of mapping additional data networks, and I felt that it was the mapping effort that was done by the in-depth networks was had very good resonance, and the proposal to do this in other networks or other data sources, other regions, would be a very useful exercise, and possibly this was sort of an ad hoc proof of principle, as we have heard, but this is something very worth sort of developing further to have a good idea about what the sort of a good characterization of possible sites for future surveillance. Here the comment was made whether it would make sense in terms of efficiency to focus or to consider urban versus rural settings, and then that was put into perspective, at least to consider the outcome in question, as there might be a difference in terms of the rural or the urban settings. I think that was, there's something missing. Okay, so I think there's about 4 or 5 slides missing for some reason. What are other elements? You need to help me now. I think there's one thing that I thought was interesting, actually, when we have a conference on harmonization, that is the term that is in the title of the conference. And some of us refer to it as maternal immunization, and some as immunization in pregnancy, and some of us as vaccination in pregnancy. And I wonder if, as part of, as one ad hoc outcome of this conference, we could actually agree on a shared term on what we're actually doing. And maybe a few things to consider here are that we've discussed this quite a bit in the Gaia project, and I thought valid comments were from the pertussis experts that maternal immunization is something that's also used as part of other strategies such as cocooning, and so the buzzword is you're a mother for life, so maternal immunization applies for longer than the time of your pregnancy. Another aspect was immunization in pregnancy kind of includes or implies that there is immunity, and that may imply something that we want to measure rather than anticipate or state as a hypothesis. So it seems to me that a very specific term that we may want to consider for use in future is vaccination in pregnancy. And I think that was a proposal by Flor Munoz to choose that. So I would very much back that proposal and see whether that will find traction. So let me stop here and see if you can help me add those pieces that I'm not able to get together anymore at this point after the conference. Please, Somali.
Look at the regulatory guidance available. So they focus on immunization and pregnancy, and that's why we had that in the title. So just something to consider.
Thank you for adding that. Yes. Are there other points of today that we would like to, if you agree, we would like to take these points that I tried to summarize from day 1 this morning and from day 2 now, that those would be kind of items where at least I feel that there's sort of convergence in the room, that there's some we need to get the wording, the wordsmithing right, but in terms of the elements, this is pretty much what has crystallized during the last 2 days.
So maybe I could just add one bullet to the last slide. I think we also talked a lot about making sure that our site selection is aligned with places where the data really support good understanding of background rates, and that's actually also important for like members of IDMCs to be able to evaluate data as they're generated and do the appropriate safety signal detection.
Yep, okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Are there other elements that people feel we should take on the outcome of this conference list? Okay, seems that either everybody's as tired as I am at this point or or we're going in the right direction. So thank you, and with this I'd like to give the word to Stephen Hirschfield for guiding us towards a discussion on next steps.
Thank you, Jan. And I may have a few other summary points since I tried to stay up to the moment and completed these just before the last panel discussion. So we'll see if the complementary set addresses the Venn diagram of what we should capture and highlight. So what next? Well, there are a few themes that seem to come out, and this was not assigned to any one specific day or session, but across multiple sessions. And these were themes of alignment, cooperation, and collaboration. So these were sharing data sources, linking to other sources and initiatives, cooperative interactions, standardization of standardization, which may become the fortune cookie phrase to emerge from this meeting, structured evaluation process, and not limit to produce, but to commit to assess and improve. So what that means is that as we are engaging in studies, that we will evaluate the process, we will assess it and try to improve it, as well as announce the outcome. I confessed before, and I'll confess again, that I have a background in oncology, and that there's been a trend for the last several years in oncology to not only compare the clinical outcomes with studies, but to put some cost and some convenience framework around those results to help in decision making. It's not just looking at a simple frequentist probabilistic outcome. And related to that, to establish a learning system where we can then bring together what we have observed and capture that along with the patient level data and some of the other data. Another theme was awareness. We have to have awareness of the factors that cannot be controlled, and this we heard in multiple dimensions across the last few days. And then we should have awareness of ongoing efforts in other biomedical specialties and also in other fields. And I'll give as an example something called uplift modeling in marketing, where uplift modeling looks to the same types of user experience as one of our panelists just discussed. Why would you want to apply a particular intervention to a particular population? And attention to the process as well as the content, so that we do capture the performance metrics and implementation costs in a structured way. Another theme was hierarchy and sequence. We need to have drivers for the definitions. Why are we making definitions? Well, we want to harmonize data capture, but we also want to have definitions that will help us address scientific or public health questions and help us perform analyses that are critical toward scientific or public health questions. So there's a lot of anticipation involved and thinking of use and reuse of data, and that's a recurrent theme too. We have complex definitions. Can we parse these definitions into simple components? And Mike Padula and I have been discussing that for some time. And can we have the opportunities to relate in part or whole with other concepts and terms? So that's leveraging maybe not an entire definition, but part of it and looking for those relationships. And just like a rondo in music where the theme keeps coming back in again and again, data use and reuse. The drivers are science, economics, and public health. But the limitations to data reuse are technical and data quality. And these technical barriers include, but they're not limited to, the format of the data, the definitions used, the availability of standards, the lack of interoperability, and other barriers could include parochialism or regionalism, resource limitations, and investigative fragmentation, as well as the fragmentation in global healthcare system with regard to resources and record-keeping standards. So the goals of the data that we collect would be to enable decision-making, understand the past, and inform the future. This leads to the question of data quality. I'm not going to read each of these definitions, but note that there are multiple definitions, and the definitions are based on characteristics of the data, but also on, is the data usable? And it's the utility of the data that in effect drives the definition of quality. So we have discussed data models. These are buzzwords which come out of anything and everything. I'm sure that in Silicon Valley there are t-shirts that have these words on them, that the data models would be modular, interoperable, scalable, and have semantic capability. To geeks, they mean something, but can we apply what they do to what we do? And there's an opportunity that we could use something called the resource description framework. This is background to say that it's something that has been in existence for 16 or 17 years already. And it consists of a basic structure where you have a subject and an object that are related, that the subject points to the object. It's not an equivalence, it's not bidirectional, but that there's a relationship. The sky is blue. The eyes are blue, or whatever it might be, but that you can describe these relationships, the simplest kinds of relationship, and that's called a triple, and then these can be built up to form maps of relationships. And using this kind of model, it becomes then just a technical exercise and implementation to bring them into the definitions, the semantics, the ontologies that could be used. So I think when we look forward, this is an area to explore. And I will note that in the imminent future, the National Cancer Institute Thesaurus and Metathesaurus will be able to export the content in RDF format as well as the current XML format. So that leads us to some kind of a diagram where we think of data collection leading to data usage, which in turn informs data models, which in turn then is subject to feasibility tests based on standards, resources, public health needs, and tools. And it's in this area on your left the feasibility and data model that I think we can make our contributions, and we can measure the impact of our contributions on the data collection and the data usage. And what would be wonderful is if there is a citation index right now for academic publications, and most of us in the room even have something called an H index that's somewhere attached to our name or our CV. But what if there was some kind of index that says the data that we contribute to, those data sets are used and reused and become valuable, sort of data citation. And if we can point to where we have data sets that we have influence through definitions, through tools, and that those data sets have added value as a result of that, I think that's an excellent measure of success. So let's have the lights on, if we could. Oh no, one more slide. Well, we can leave this with the lights on. Let's leave the lights on. I want to remind us that no matter how enthusiastic and how ambitious we might wish to be, that there's a need to accept current laws, regulations, and policies, that we must have awareness and respect for the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved, that we should adapt before we invent, emphasize the highest achievable quality, not accept the lowest common denominator, and anticipate and proactively address barriers. And I think we heard some excellent examples today. I'll again cite Dr. Schmiglo and Dr. Steinhoff and Dr. Clark, who all showed us approaches of how you can anticipate and proactively address barriers. And it requires resources to do that. So I will stop there. And Mike Podula, did you want to add something?
I think you covered it extremely well and brought it a few steps further. I think it's great.
Well, thank you. And there's relatively few of us left, so everyone would have an opportunity to say something if you have the energy to do so at this moment. Miriam, looks like you're looking at a microphone. No? You're speechless for the moment. Okay. Yes, sir.
So let me just throw out that building on your principles, we're trying to do something fairly ambitious here that as the literature search showed that while we've done this in the developed world, we're really only making very small initial steps in low and middle income countries. And therefore, the bridging processes, it seems to me that we start first with applying the Gaia case definitions to the developed world databases to see how they work. Then we start to look at middle income countries separately from low income countries. And the middle income countries, in Latin America, for example, presumably there's a whole series of improvements in surveillance that is ongoing in conjunction with Zika, and we'll see where that leads us. And then separately from the different clinical trials that are going on in depths and other sites in low-income countries, we start to look ahead to post-licensure to see beyond RCT what kind of training and other things could be done to enhance those sites. So just that then would be a way to kind of get beyond where we are today.
Right, so staged approach. Is it Dr. Allen? I'm sorry, I'm mixing you up with someone, but you have a microphone turned on. Oh, okay. And it was Dr. Allen, right? Okay. Sir.
I have a point regarding that, and I hope it's not taken the wrong way, but one thing is that Latin America is a very good example of how you actually move those things into low and middle income countries. And I think we tend to forget that PAHO is in Washington, but the rest of the continent works in a different way. There's surveillance, and it didn't start with Zika, it started with the rotavirus and other things. There are national regulatory authorities that are WHO certified, so the continent has a strength in that sense, and it has a unity through the leadership of PAHO that can be used in that. The problem is that we use Spanish as our main language, and the Chinese use Chinese, and the French part of Africa uses French, and we tend to make ourselves understood as universal by things that are written only in English. So if you really want to have a use beyond the English-speaking world of these consensus, of the Brighton definitions, you need to start doing translations. I mean, and otherwise you will not be able to engage with the local population. Many of them have studied in places where they have had to use English. It's not the researchers, it's the people who do the work, as we saw in certain parts of Africa, where the examples that we saw, or in the Gambia, where you need to use the local languages. And I think that is a step that we tend to forget. The other thing is that a lot of these semantics are very important when you translate things. If you just use Spanish for stillbirths, it's an oxymoron, because we say about the birth of a dead person, so the death means that it was alive, but it wasn't. So it has a connotation of difficulty to have a simple understanding in another language of exactly what you're saying. Perhaps at this level of development of the whole work that is being done, there should be at least an effort to move into another level, so that you actually bring in other people into the fold, and you can start really talking about the possibility of doing this type of trials in places that do not use English or are not related to English-speaking researchers in that way.
Thank you, Dr. Cravioto. I'd like to respond on 3 levels. The first is kind of whimsical, but what you don't realize with these uniforms is that they have a Kevlar lining, so we're impervious to insults or to misunderstanding things that are potentially offensive in other contexts. So I certainly would never be offended. Secondly, that I recall I was reviewing in another capacity a study where the study was in Europe, and there was many patients enrolled in France, and there was a line that a patient had missed a scheduled visit because of a heart problem. And this was then a terrible signal, because people were trying to figure out, and they were requesting the cardiogram, and they wanted to know if the patient was hospitalized. And it turned out to be that the translation of the medical record was done by a non-technical translating firm, and they had taken the words literally. So in French, when someone has a sympathetic reaction, it turned out that the patient missed the visit because it was his mother's birthday. And the doctor had some sympathy for that situation, and so he noted that using the word heart, felt with the heart or something to this effect, that was noted in the medical record why he missed the appointment. But lastly, I was involved for several years in a large cohort study that was partnering with 5 other large cohort studies with an aggregate sample of close to 500,000 children. And we took translation quite seriously. And we actually, I just spent the last weekend trying to edit our paper on the advantages but challenges involved in translatability. So I think it's a very actual topic, and one which we, if we approach it in a structured way and say people, this is a method that we got agreement and global studies in multiple regions on how to approach it, then we can proceed. And that's much more effective than just making a blanket statement. You have an obligation or a moral imperative to translate, or even a practical imperative, but to say, yes, we agree, and this is how we think we could go about it. And I think that exploring that within the Gaia project would be an important step once we get the concepts worked out. Because we don't want to go back and start translating over and over again with lots of heart. Yes, Flora.
Thank you. So I actually would submit that this is a time when we are seeing, at least in maternal immunization, research globally like we have never seen before. And also the second comment is that we probably don't need to really, in terms of the Gaia documents and the Gaia project, it is designed to be applicable now in multiple settings. That is the whole point of the different levels of certainty and the definitions. And so that a stepwise approach might really not be necessary at this point.
I think that's going to be a partial agreement. I think that we're going to say we have things which are, in the US there's a expression that goes shovel ready, means you're ready to start construction, and we have other things that are still in the blueprint stage. So I saw Mariana.
I would like to think about steps forward in a very practical way, because I'm a very practical person, being a neonatologist or whatever I am. So in my opinion is, let's use this, whatever we got thus far, put it in first studies that come along and test it. We absolutely need to know how good this is. And one of the examples that we got when we kind of looked at the literature and said, how does it fit literature? We said, well, it doesn't fit. And then was, well, how does it fit retrospective analysis? But then we looked, if we put a questionnaire in front of people, there are many yeses on that questionnaire, and there were different levels of certainty. So my pledge would be that we try to go and use this, and we refine it as we go along, because we will get better and better quality data as we, first of all, try to better test it, and second, we refine it with time. Because I would be worried that it will take us too long to develop all different possible definitions and develop all different CRFs that we can come along with. Let's go try it out. That's my pledge. Thank you.
So to rephrase, the perfect is the enemy of the good enough. Okay? I think there's great interest to move these things quickly. But I think we're trying to think of what the scope of these things are. We have some things which are shovel-ready, and others which we can contemplate about continuing.
When you can't use the Gaia definitions, you use whatever we have left, and then we know which definitions we have to work on. I kind of think about the drawing I put on one of my slides. Is that the Gaia definitions are very little, but there are other data sets, and we can go to those data sets. But let's try to see if we can use it in clinical trials, which will be very, very difficult, but we can definitely do it in observational trials, and we'll collect a very good data on natural histories for the places where we will go eventually.
Noted. Any other comments? Yes, Dr. Clark.
I mean, I suppose I'd just reiterate that, really. I mean, I think at the moment, we have nothing to work with in many cases in terms of specific case definitions for anything. I mean, something that came up entirely unrelated to maternal vaccination was in a pneumococcal vaccine trial we're just doing recently. How are you diagnosing pneumonia versus bronchiolitis, and you'll give it, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly you find and actually realize, we're not using specific case definitions in that case. So I think having anything to work with albeit limited in terms of range of definitions now, is a great start. And only through applying them, finding where they work, and refining them, as was just said, that's got to be the way forward, as far as I can see.
Well, I think there's great enthusiasm for the approach, and while we do it, we should think of how we want to measure the success and uptake and utility as we go through that. Any other comments? Well, let's return to this slide, because I would like to say that all of you are always welcome here, and that we have enjoyed your presence over the last few days, some of you 3 days, some of you 2 days, some of you it probably feels like 6 weeks that you've been here. But for us it was an honor and a privilege to host this conference, and I think now we will declare this meeting closed. Thank you.